What is up, everyone? It's week 7, and as we do every week, we have to take a look and see whose stock I'm buying this week. It's the Bullish Report. Let's get into it. Welcome back to Fantasy Bankroll. I'm your host, Robert Banker. Thank you so much for checking us out as always. It's week 7, and week 6 was crazy. There was a lot of injuries to major players. So hopefully you saw my waiver wire report and were able to get some of those claims in and fill your roster until some of those injured players get back. And we got 2 teams on bye this week, the Bills and the Ravens. So that means there's no Ravens defense for any of your offensive players to take advantage of. But that doesn't mean there's not a lot of good matchups out there. So as we do every week, let's get started by taking a look at some of the quarterbacks with good matchups. Let's go! All right, the first quarterback in my Bullish Report this week, Dallas Cowboys quarterback Dak Prescott. Now, Prescott is currently second in the league in passing yards and passing touchdowns. And he's about to get CeeDee Lamb back. And even if it's in a limited capacity, it's still going to make his life that much easier. And Washington is currently bottom 5 in fantasy points allowed to opposing quarterbacks on a weekly basis. So there's absolutely no reason to sit Dak this week. All right, the next quarterback in my Bullish Report for week 7, Detroit Lions quarterback Jared Goff. Now, the Bucs have allowed 10 passing touchdowns and are allowing over 250 passing yards per week to opposing quarterbacks this season. And Goff currently leads the NFL with 14 passing touchdowns and is averaging over 230 yards a game. And with the second highest implied point total for the week, Vegas thinks it's going to be a shootout, which certainly favors the possibility of Goff having a big game this week. All right, the last quarterback in my Bullish Report for week 7, Chicago Bears quarterback Caleb Williams. Now, the Saints are giving up the 4th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks on the season, including being one of 5 teams that's giving up more than 2 passing touchdowns per week. And I think this week, Williams continues that streak and pushes the Bears' win streak to 4. All right, the first running back in my Bullish Report for week 7, Washington Commanders running back Ja'Cory Krosky-Merritt. Now, Bill has been having a great season so far, averaging 5.7 yards per carry. And the Cowboys are allowing the 5th most fantasy points to opposing running backs on the season, including allowing the most receiving yards to opposing running backs on a weekly basis. Now, hopefully for fantasy GMs, that's a weakness that the Commanders can take advantage of this week. All right, let's talk about the next running back in my Bullish Report this week, Carolina Panthers running back Rico Dowdle. Now, the Jets have been surprisingly bad, ranking bottom 10 in rushing yards allowed and fantasy points allowed to opposing running backs on the season. And unless you've been sleeping the past 2 weeks, Dowdle's been running like a man possessed, amassing 473 total yards in the last 2 games. And even if Hubbard comes back this week, I still think Dowdle sees the majority of the carries, and he's shown that he can take advantage of whatever opportunity he's given. All right, let's talk about the last running back in my Bullish Report for week 7, Cleveland Browns running back Quinshon Judkins. Now, the Dolphins are giving up a league-worst 183 total yards per week to the running back position, including allowing 5.6 yards per rushing attempt. And Judkins enters the game averaging 4.6 yards per rushing attempt and 7th in the league in rushing yards on a weekly basis. And I know fantasy GMs will agree with me, since no Browns receiver can seem to catch anything thrown their way, you might as well give Judkins 20-plus touches this week. First wide receiver on my Bullish Report for week 7, Tampa Bay Buccaneers wide receiver Tez Johnson. Now, the Lions are giving up 25.3 fantasy points per week to the wide receiver position, which ranks 30th in the league. And with reports saying Mike Evans has still been limited in practice this week, someone's going to have to catch the passes that Mayfield's throwing this week. And if you need any more reason, Vegas thinks it's going to be the second highest scoring game this week. All right, the next receiver on my Bullish Report for week 7, Denver Broncos wide receiver Courtland Sutton. The Giants are allowing 15 catches for 185 yards and 1 touchdown per week to wide receivers this season. And after disappearing last week with only 1 catch against Sauce Gardner and the Jets, Sutton will look to take advantage of a much better matchup this week. All right, let's talk about the last receiver on my Bullish Report for week 7, Los Angeles Chargers wide receiver Ladd McConkey. Now, this might be just because I'm a McConkey fantasy owner, but it was nice to finally see him get going in week 6. And I think he carries that momentum into week 7 against a Colts team that's been one of the worst in the league against the wide receiver position in fantasy this season, including ranking in the bottom 5 against slot receivers. So come on, McConkey, let's get another one this week. All right, who's the first tight end on my Bullish Report this week? Detroit Lions tight end Sam Laporta. Now, the Bucs have been pretty good at limiting opposing tight ends in regards to catches and yards, but they've been second worst in the league at allowing touchdowns to the position. And Laporta's just starting to heat up after 2 straight weeks with a touchdown. And I think this week he makes it 3 in a row. All right, the next tight end on my Bullish Report for week 7, Cleveland Browns tight end Harold Fannin Jr. Now, Fannin already has over a 16% target share in the Browns offense. And the Dolphins are allowing the 6th most fantasy points to opposing tight ends this season. And with it looking like David Njoku's going to miss this game, Fannin's target share should be well over 20% this week. And as we know in fantasy, it's all about opportunities. All right, the last player on my bullish report for week 7, Philadelphia Eagles tight end Dallas Goedert. Now, the Vikings D's been pretty good against wide receivers this season, but not so much against opposing tight ends, where they've given up the 6th most fantasy points inside the red zone to the position. But luckily for the Eagles, Jalen Hurts only likes to pass to Dallas Goedert anyway. So I see another big week for Dallas Goedert and his fantasy owners everywhere. All right, that'll do it for the Week 7 Bullish Report on Fantasy Bankroll. Thank you so much for checking it out. If you want to see who I'm avoiding this week, I'll post a link to my bearish report up here. Please share this with other fantasy football fans and like and subscribe on YouTube. And let's get ready for another winning week. Let's go!